I'm here with two great writers, two stalwarts in writing, whom you heard both of them yesterday, brilliantly telling us the state of the world. Peter, that was really fascinating yesterday. And Abraham in the morning telling us his own journey, the journey of not only him, his family and himself, but the journey of his patience and the way in which individual destinies are impacted by geography. It was a fabulous, both talks were very important from two reasons. One is when we heard Abraham's journey about the personal being impactful on, from the point of view of landscape, how people's lives are changed and affected by their movements, by the migration of their families, and by the overall impact of that on the characters that he evolves in his brilliant writing. Peter has also spoken to us and presented a very, almost I would say, a frightening scenario of what is happening now with the impact of climate change on populations, on human habitation. And I think it's important that we hear from both of them about how climate and geography has impacted the lives of people and what we need to do going forward. Can I start with you, Abraham? If you can, it was a brilliant talk yesterday. Thank you very much for sharing your personal journey. And I think it was very, very moving from the point of view of the different scenarios that you inhabited, starting with one of my favorites, my own country, where I think as a young medical student, you felt the small town America, the geography of that small town, revealed secrets that you discovered, and the way in which you evolved through that. Can you talk us through that a little bit, please?
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be on the stage with Peter, with you. I want to just begin by reading you something, and I wonder if you recognize this. It's from a book that I just got, and it was really a wonderful definition of the importance of geography, especially of a home. And it goes like this. Can you all hear me, by the way, pretty well? It says, the notion of ura is very intrinsic to the Tamil person, especially in rural areas, and is derived from a strong spiritual notion, which in turn is intimately connected to the person's own experience. For the Tamil villager, ura is likely to have more resonance, coming as it does from a person-centric and highly individualized relationship experience, rather than the larger constructs of state and nation. The notion of ura carries with it a rich emotional content that includes not only the physicality of the place of origin, where perhaps centuries of family connection exist, but also ties in with a deeply felt bond of religious affinity with a family god, the Kulludevyam, which many Tamil Hindu families hold as sacred.
I think I was meant to question him, and I don't know how he turned the tables and picked me up now, and I think we'll go back to him. And you haven't answered my question, so let's go back to that.
In case you didn't recognize that, that's her fabulous book, which I'm now halfway through. If you don't know it, you should get a hold of it. The Tamils. Yeah, I think, my relationship with geography is, I suppose, the inverse of that, in the sense that I was born in Africa, in Ethiopia, but of Indian parents who had gone there to teach. And, I'm still I'm pretty fluent in Amharic, and that was my home until in my 20s, because of revolution and civil war, I was displaced. And mind you, I had a very strong link with India, with Kerala, but also with Madras, because I did some of my studies here. Nevertheless, I had to pretty much give up the concept of my home, my homeland. I don't think I ever had one, but I wasn't aware of it until the moment of displacement. And since then, I've made, several journeys from Ethiopia to India, to America. And with each change, geography has turned out to be highly significant for destiny. So that phrase, geography is destiny, I believe came from Napoleon, talking about France's place in the world. But I think it applies to each of us. And, I think, if anything, I've not had a geography that I could claim as my own. I think that's been personally a bit of a disadvantage. I've been envious of people who have you know, the centuries of connection, the family deity. But for a writer, it's not a bad thing. When I wrote my first book, set in Johnson City, Tennessee, one of the highest compliments I received was from locals, from the townsfolk, who said, you know, we've lived here all our lives and we had stopped seeing or had not noticed some of the things that you picked up. So I think being an outsider, being a perennial outsider, gives you a unique observation point, a point of view. Similarly, my second book, The Tennis Partner, was set in El Paso. And as an outsider on this intriguing American-Mexican border where all these mythologies play out, you know, the mythology of the conquistador, the cowboy, the vaqueros, you know, it took an outsider, I think, to be able to not skip over the things that a local might have taken for granted. And so, to me, the notion of geography is terribly important. When I write fiction, I think of geography as perhaps the most important single decision you can make. I mean, you could set those same characters that are in Covenant of Water in another land, in another time, and it would be a completely different story because the characters would be different. So I think I've taken too much time already answering your question, but my aim was to make sure that our interlocutor is also part of this conversation, not just giving us questions, but I want to hear what you think about Uru.
Okay. Thank you, but still you seem to have made an Uru out of Johnson City. I got the sense when I was reading My Own Country. You did even say that this is my own country. Now, were you able to transition quickly to Ethiopia, to El Paso, and then subsequently Kerala? So each of these places did become your home. So I'm just kind of countering what you said about not having a home.
Well, I mean, actually, I used the title My Own Country for the first book out of a sense of irony. And it came from a wonderful poem by Malcolm Cowley, I believe, that goes like this. Not that the pines were darker there, nor mid-May dogwood brighter there, nor swifts more swift in summer air, but it was my own country. And the reason I picked that is because for the individuals I was describing, gay men who had chose to leave that town in their teens as part of the exodus for education, etc., because they knew that their sexuality would not be accepted in that town. The only way that they could have a life was to leave that town and go live in the big city. And decades later, they get infected with HIV, come back, and then I wind up caring for them. For them, the irony was this was their own country, and yet their sexuality made them aliens. And even though I loved the place and claimed it as my own, I would never be, one of the people. I would stand out just by virtue of my appearance, my accent. So there was some irony in my picking that title. Am I at home where I am now? Yeah, I think I'm at home as much as I will ever be wherever I am, but I think there's always this sense of being a perennial outsider, and someone's going to tap you on the shoulder one day, and especially at Stanford where I work, where there's a lot of legends. Many of them are legends in their own mind, but they're nevertheless very self-confident. I often have the sense that at any moment, someone could say, we're on to you, you're out of here.
Could I just draw Peter into this? In many ways, your work is more as an outsider, so to speak, in the sense that you know about all these experiences, displaced populations, civilizations dying, but then the personal story or the personal perspectives do remain. And compared to what Abraham writes, in what way do you think your writing is different, but at the same time, powerful impact of geography persists in your work as well?
What a great session to be part of and to share a stage with both of you. It's a real privilege. Well, I have lots of shortcuts because I'm not a soloist. My orchestra is of the voices of many, many men and women who've lived before me in different parts of the world, and I have the luxury of being able to amplify their voices. So when you work as a historian, one of the things you learn very quickly is how to deal with primary sources, people writing in past periods. And sometimes people writing in the past have views that are wrong, or they're contentious, or they're controversial, they're difficult, they feel outdated, but they are still people commenting on what they see in front of them. And I think one of the challenges when you write about about the world is that we leave 99% of the people behind, right? So here in Chennai over this weekend, I don't think anybody's going to talk about Central or South America. It's unlikely we hear too much about West Africa or North Africa. We have the dignity, as I think, of trying to fix issues to do with colonialism here in South Asia. That's something that's really important in conversations here in Chennai. But we can have conversations about geography without remembering that most of the world's population, in the high 90%, don't leave home. And when they do leave home, it's either because they're an elite traveller who's able to go and journey to be a scholar. You know, my job is one of profound indulgence and good luck and chance. But for most people in this city, the ability to leave home is minimal. It's to do with economic necessity, normally. So I think the perspective on what you think about geography is how do you then use this orchestra of voices to illuminate the past to readers, whatever their socioeconomic background, whichever country they come from, that tries to be more inclusive. And you know, one of the words we talk about in my academic world is global history or world history, or trying to connect different parts of the world together. You know, just hearing Shashi Tharoor at the end of the last session talking about inclusivity, that's something which we don't do enough of, I think, when we write about the world around us, because we shed light on the things we're interested in, and it's hard to do it in a bigger picture. So some of that means going to learn lots of languages. Some of that means working hard to focus on things that you don't know. I absolutely agree with Abraham. Being an outsider gives you a privileged vantage point, but sometimes a very misleading one, because you claim the right of objectivity that is self-appointed, like our academic colleagues, the greatness in their own mind. But I think that when one thinks about geography and destiny, one of the things that's easy to overlook is change. So here in your beautiful city of Chennai, I last came here before COVID, and the city's changed dramatically. So in theory, it's the same place. In theory, it's many friends, people I've met before, and so lovely to be back. But the city's changed. And one of the things I was thinking about, I had a sleepless night last night. I've got too many projects on the go. And sometimes you should sleep so you can get through them. But anyway, I had one of those nights. And one of the things I couldn't help think about was that everybody who lived roughly in this location that's now Chennai, until about 50 years ago, everybody's experience of the natural world was very different. At night, you could see the stars. And since 1960, looking up into the sky here in Chennai, no one could see the stars. And when you can connect to the world in a different way of being aware of the size of the cosmos, seeing shooting stars at night, seeing the glare of the moon, seeing the reactions of animal life, responding to the cycles of nature, then your impression of your own self is very different. So change is such an important part of writing, it's such an important part of history, and could be, I think, underwhelming when we think about the world. We feel very certain as human beings that we can make sense of the world around us. We feel certain that science makes improvements. But, you know, one of the things I was saying yesterday was, you know, just how clever people were in the past. You know, mathematicians in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, working with ideas about the circumference of the Earth, measurement of angles, complex mathematics, beyond the ability of probably, well, we have Nobel Prize winners here as well as Abraham today, so with very distinguished company, but, you know, are beyond the skills of most university humanities students. And I think that positioning of history to explain that it's not just about geography or destiny, but around where we sit within this large time and space continuum. And I think history can really help us by grounding us in reminding us that, you know, big buildings, whether you know, what we heard this morning of the Chola dynasty, big buildings, big theatres are the product of the establishment of hierarchies, whether they're religious ones or secular ones. The building of big walls, the building of temples, the building of palaces are expressions of power. And those are histories that are of the elites. So for us to be all-inclusive, we need to remember that history is about the mundane. It's about women's experiences that until recently are excluded. It's about the experience of labour forces whose voices are often not recorded by history, and not just about great rulers and empires in the past.
Thank you very much. That was a great response. And I want to ask you, Abraham, because you moved from memoir writing to fiction, did it give you the kind of flexibility that Peter's talking about the ability to go into different spaces and reset history with the geography and to explore more of the individual history as well as this notion of identity, especially through your characters?
Are you asking if it was a different strategy?
Yes,
because
a whole different way of looking at
Yeah.
it, right? He writes a different kind of writing. Yours is different.
Well, I'm not sure. I think that with both the nonfiction books I wrote, the geography was terribly important to the story. I think it gave more than just a background to the story, because it strikes me, and it strikes me even more as every year passes, that so much of our character, despite our notions of inclusivity and being part of a greater fabric, increasingly you're seeing a world that is more and more regional, and much more, this is my place, not your place, and we're seeing that playing out in California. Trump wants to, what did he say, buy Mexico, and Mexico had to remind Trump that that was Mexico and they want to buy it back. So that kind of rhetoric just shocks me, because I think we always expect that with every decade, as we become more scientifically advanced, that we would, by virtue of our intellectual growth, become more inclusive people. I think the opposite turns out to be true. And no, I don't think that strategically writing a book of fiction versus nonfiction, my approach to the geography was any different. I think they're very much the same. What surprised me with The Covenant of Water, I mean, here I was describing a very small imagined village in Kerala, and describing the rituals of one family and the broader rituals of their community of Syrian Christians. And what is striking to me is how much that story has resonated with people from all cultures. It's resonated with Western audiences who are the main readers, but it's also been translated into 22 languages. And I think that's because there's an archetypal recognition of archetypal elements that are common wherever you are. And so in some ways our notions of geography are important, but they're also so wrapped up in our rituals, but those rituals are very much the same at their root from place to place. So no, I don't think that my approach is very different to geography. I think, if anything, I have equal respect for the importance of geography, whatever genre you're writing in.
This notion of inclusivity that both of you mentioned, it has to be a conscious act in your writing. Did you have to sort of, when you looked at the whole earth, for instance, did you make sure that you included the past, the present, and possibly hints for the future? And looking at different, how did you choose what to write about?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's a good psychiatrist question. I'm not quite sure looking back on it, and also you trick yourself once you've written something about what the motivations and so on. I think that, look, I'm a professor at one of the world's top universities. It often is ranked number one in the world, for good reason. And it's the job, it's a quote of one of my favorite historians who said that the job of a historian is to be brave and to be ambitious. And so that means going to learn new things. And, I'm in a generation where history itself is changing, both because of the ways in which we're engaging with the past, new national histories that are insistent about the role of India in shaping the world, or the role of China in shaping the world, or the role of America in shaping the world. And that pushes against ideas where you can talk about connections and you could talk about equalities. So I think it's important, if you are in a position where you have an ability to write about large pictures, to then go and do the work to learn about South Pacific societies, or societies, for example, in West Africa, that have spent a lot of time reading work by lots of my colleagues in universities that we should engage with a lot more as well. So some of it is about trying to put that big canvas, but I think probably one of the things that's worth reminding is that geography is a prison, as well as the way that history is, because history solidifies the topics, the people, the names, the events that are important. It creates a kind of hierarchy, and geography has been a terrible thing to imprison the way we think about the world. So in every single culture, written culture, you have ideas about how people behave when they live in the tropics, how people behave if they're a certain skin color. And that's not just about Europeans projecting into the colonial period, although they were responsible for lots of this, but you find Arab writers in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries writing about how people behave in East Africa, how they behave in India, how they behave in the north. People in the north with the terribly light skin color, incapable of rational thought, mindless violence, and so on. And things which, when you read them, can be quite amusing and quite entertaining, these stereotypes. But those tropes themselves are, they are the source of prejudice, of course, because they categorize everybody the same way. So I think one of the things to do is to try to add nuance, to try to be granular. But geography is a real challenge. I mean, one of the things I've been very interested in writing about, reading about, and then writing about are levels of trust in regions of the world that have exposure to high disease environment. And I'd be very interested to hear what both of you think about that. Where you have shorter life expectancies, then expectations in life tend to be different to if you are in a benign disease environment where your expectation when you're born is that you'll have a long life. And that's perhaps one reason. There's a lot of discussion amongst anthropologists about the need to be incredibly careful with data and material and conclusions. But as a sort of starting point, it looks like institutions as you rise towards the northern latitudes tend to function better. People tend to be better at distributing geographical, calorific, men and women's calorie intake of protein in Scandinavia in the Viking Age was about 50-50. And in most societies further south, it tends to be heavily skewed towards men eating more protein. And one needs to think about what those explanations might be. And the difficulty with being a historian or a geographer or a writer is that, or a medic, is that when you diagnose, you often diagnose with certainty. And again, something that Shashi Tharoor said at the end of the last session is that the definite article, the ability to allow that there are other opinions, the ability to explain that there doesn't have to be a single solution or a single motivation, there's complexity in the human condition, is a really interesting and important one. So the palette of the top things that I like to write about are typically things that I don't already have a view on, that I'll read more and more. I try to work out what I think. But there's a real responsibility, if you get an opportunity to come to wonderful festivals like this, to not just recycle the same stories, to come and help open windows or doors that, if there's a single person in the room here who is inspired to learn about Central Asia or about South Pacific or about West Africa or about Tennessee, then, we've done our job because we've helped open those opportunities for new thinking, new research. And that's one of the things I found most unusual and hardest about having a higher profile as a writer, is that there's a responsibility that comes with that too. And I think some of that responsibility is trying to push people into areas and topics they don't always necessarily think about. So that's harder. It's much easier for me to write about English history, the War of the Roses, which lots of my friends do, and they're brilliant scholars. But to try to think big it's hard, because it comes with lots of dangers. But I think it's a responsibility, and personally, I think that's what academic scholarship should look like, things that are really challenging.
What would you think about that? Thank you very much.
Only a small level of applause, but I should be a politician, maybe I get a...
Thank you. There you go. They've made up for it.
Thank you.
Well, I must say, I admire the work of historians. I think they have such an important role, especially when, of late, people are trying to rewrite history. I think it's very much part of nationalism, is to try and retell the story of the geography in a way that suits the prevailing powers that be. And I think, in literature, you have wonderful examples of how literature can distort history. For so many, many years, the Western concept of India was a very romantic one. And it was because of Kipling, and it was because of, all the colonial writers who came here had a very privileged existence. And I think the reality was quite different. Had we heard the voices of Indian writers with equal vigor, we would have known that, far from civilizing us, the British pillaged and looted India As Shashi Tharoor has pointed out in some of his wonderful writing and speech, the very word loot is something borrowed from the Indian language. So I think literature has a responsibility to, and history has a responsibility to try and get at the truth, which is very, very difficult when you're looking back, especially when you're looking further and further back. I'm intrigued by your work, especially by your recent interest in Russia and Ukraine, and to me that's an embodiment of the kind of things that fascinate me as a novelist. Here you have a land where people had slight differences, but they belonged to one nation, and they coexisted fairly peacefully. Then they became two nations, and now they become arch enemies. But the trouble is there are many Russians, ethnic Russians living in Ukraine, or people sympathetic to Russia. As a historian, how do you approach the current dialogue of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine in terms of the geography?
I don't talk about ethnicity, because that's a genetic question and it's a scientific one. Then we start to measure people on their blood groups and on their genetic composition. And I think that we should have learnt that thinking about ethnicity opens up difficult and dangerous doors to control of the past, present, and the future. And a lot of those things, Russia is a colonial power. It looks different to Britain. It looks different to the Spanish. But Russia, between 1812 and 1912, so the course of 100 years, expanded at an average rate of 55 square kilometers per day. Right? So Russia is a colonial power, just like China is a colonial power. China doubled in size under the Qing dynasty. And those narratives are ones that are very easy to lose. India is also colonial power. It depends which we mean by India and how we connect this wonderful subcontinent into a single entity where we leave Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Burma, where we see former Indian diasporas. I think those ideas around pasts and presents, I think, are very thorny ones. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, it's the use of violence and preceded by the use of history. So all of my colleagues who worked on Ukrainian Russian medieval history all got fired between 2008 and 2012. History books started to be rewritten that were insistent about, not just about the Middle Ages and the foundation of cities like Kiev and Chernigov and Smolensk, and Novgorod, the great sort of first cities that were founded by Scandinavians, actually, who were the great traders of the time, Vikings, who came down the river systems and founded what became Russia and Ukraine. But you can see that similar story about how history is being written today here in India, or in China, in Turkey, in Iran, and in the United States. The pushback about woke history, or the idea that this is what we should be writing, thinking about, that's political decisions. That's nothing to do with genetics, ethnicity, language groups, religions, faith, culture. That's to do with power and the use by small numbers of people who are parts of hierarchical elites to maximize their own opportunities. So what we saw in Ukraine was a long time coming, but if you study the 20th century, if one looks at the 20th century, the suffering of people in Ukraine in the 1920s with famine and the 1930s, I've had to work through some of it was a genocide of people in Ukraine in the 1930s, where you read about school children dying at their desks, reports written by their teachers about people dying of malnutrition. Then you can see that this is part of a much longer story of oppression that is colonial in the same way as Kipling and how things worked in India. It's about extraction and it's about control. So I think when one tries to be dispassionate, history is also political, regardless of how one tries to skin the cat. So one can see other people's versions of history being political, but one shouldn't have the claim that my own version is not doing something similar. But those insistence at government level to tell stories in a particular way, it's important. I mean, what you were saying about one of the responses to British and European colonialism in across all of Asia, from Turkey, India, China, and particularly Japan, was the emphasis of ideas about the Silk Roads being connected.
People who are there under various kinds of visas, if he were overnight to impose tariffs on Canada, if he were to do all the things that he says he's going to do, there's going to be tremendous pain and hardship. It can only work if you have a story that matches the reality or the unreality of what he's doing. And I think the astonishing thing to me as a novelist is that so far he has managed to survive crisis after crisis, mostly by denial, but also by spinning a story. You have to give him credit for that, spinning a story that somehow encompasses the disasters and blames those on somebody else, and encompasses the victories that belong to other people as his own. So, as a novelist, which is the only way I can be qualified to look at this, it is intriguing to me to see how much story matters. And I wonder how historians, when they talk about the history, do you look at the story that held sway at that moment?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's such a great conversation. I mean, the story matters, but it doesn't have to have any connection with reality. So in the United States, the story is equality. It's about freedom from the tyranny of the British Empire. But a large driving part of the push towards independence was the fear that slavery was going to be abolished. And the great signatories of the US Declaration of Independence were slave owners who wanted to maintain their slave plantations. That story of the American dream is one that all of us have heard and read about, and there's some truth in all of that. But in the late 19th century, there were riots because ethnic categorizations meant that if you were from Northern Europe, you were welcomed. If you were from a Protestant, Scandinavian, or Northern European country. But if you were Spanish or Italian or Portuguese, you were unwelcome. There were great riots across New York City, in Boston, and lynch mobs to try to stop undesirable Europeans who were considered dirty, unclean, Catholic on top. Then the next wave was Irish and Polish. And so the story of America being anti-immigrants is not just a story about this current administration or something that's new in the last few years. It's been constantly there. The anti-Chinese legislation in the early 20th century to stop Chinese settlers, people buying US businesses, internment of Japanese during the Second World War, and then, of course, Hispanic, South American, Latin American. It's part of the whole truth and the reality of the United States is to be highly selective in how it tells the story. So it's inclusive at the top level, where people are made to feel that they can make it, but actually the reality doesn't always work that way. And as you know, Abraham, as an incredible high achiever in your own right, the wealth, literal wealth, but also the wealth of ideas that are brought in by outsiders has shaped the 20th and 21st century United States in ways that no one could ever have imagined. That Indian heritage leaders of the great tech companies today in the United States, from Google to Microsoft, there's a reason why outsiders can often flourish. But the reality and the story are two very, very different things. So where we are probably now is at a tipping point where that narrative about anti-immigration shuts the door on some of the things that made America great. We have very similar discussions all over Europe too. And in fact, when one pushes into the discussions, very quickly one reaches into racial and ethnic ideas that it's okay if you come from England to settle the United States. But then what kind of English person you are, what kind of socioeconomic background, and above all, what heritage you have, comes into play quite quickly. And as a historian, having seen the damage that racial history did in the 20th century, not only with the Holocaust, of course, and profound suffering, but it tells me that we historians haven't done our job well enough to live in a world where those racial categorizations are back and alive and well. And those aren't just in Europe and the West. We see those here in India, where if you're from the wrong kind of background or wrong kind of religious background, wrong kind of ethnicity group, then the state will try and legislate against you, will protect what you talk about, how you talk about it, and in some cases will act against you. And even on the stage at an event like this, one has to be careful talking about Sikhism or Islam or about minority rights. So the reality of the lived experience is very different to the idea that we live in inclusive societies where everybody's equal. And it's the real job, not of historians, but of lawmakers and of the courts to fulfill their obligations properly. And the politicization of the justice systems in democracies is one of the biggest trends over the last 10 years that should make most of us, I think, worried.
I have a question I've been dying to ask you, Nama. So, I as I mentioned yesterday, I have a love affair with this city for many years and a great fondness for the Tamil people. And so your book was tremendously edifying for me, filling in gaps that I had no idea about. So let me ask you, what is it about Tamil Nadu, the geography, that is responsible for some of the wonderful things you write about, the Sangam movement, the great poetry, you know, all the wonderful things that you have elucidated in the book? Where did geography play into that? And so please tell us about that.
I think the earliest communities of Tamil people decided to divide their habitation into 5 different zones, eco-zones, as Peter knows, and the 5 Thinais. And you know, there's the forest area, there was the desert area, there's a seaside, and you know, a couple of others, just the alluvial land. And I think civilizations and communities grew specifically with specific professions that were oriented to the geography of that land in those spaces. And I think the Tamil people, I mean, migration happened, people moved, there was trade, as Peter said, and a lot of things happened. But I think we were lucky in the establishment of that kind of geography right from the beginning. It helped us at that point to set up these self-sustaining communities, so to speak. Much later, there were differences, religious divide. There was a violence also of communities, one against the other. It was not all a rosy picture, Abraham, but it was, I think it sort of set the tone for the success of local communities right from the early ages of Tamil history. So that's how I think it began. Of course, it didn't last like that, and as Peter said, there's been, the lack of inclusivity. There's been privilege that's been, let me say, seized by certain groups of people. And there was a lot of unevenness until the early 20th century, with the freedom movement as well as the Dravidian movement, which is very important, which kind of worked to reorder and reshape the social and political aspects of the state. But we've gone through our ups and downs as well. And on the whole, I think there is the sense of being together, the sense of being Tamil, kind of dominates, and there's this easy familiarity with which communities move within each other and with each other. So I think that makes this place, I mean, I'm not trying to be, idealize this in any way at all. There's a continuous, for instance, violence against the Dalit communities. It's just not spoken enough, and many of them felt that they don't want to be considered part of because the Dravidian movement has excluded them in some ways. I mean, especially current day political structures. And you talked about politics, Peter. So I think that's impacted a lot of the well-being of people in various ways. And Tamil Nadu is no exception.
And we were talking last night at dinner. I mean, of course, the experience of partition here was very different in Tamil Nadu to the north. So that means responses to 20th century histories, but also today, look different further north.
And I think the caste aspect is a big thing. You mentioned caste yesterday, right? And right from the Chola, post-Chola era, it became much more sort of structured and rigid. And until then, there was a kind of an easy thing with the Sangam age and all of that. But I think not to over-romanticize any of that, the lurking violence between people and between communities, I think it's one of the strongest things we need to counter in all of India, not just Tamil Nadu. This whole thing about caste and privilege that continues to impact society. So it says time's up, and I want to say thank you to these two wonderful writers for a very enlightening conversation. And we'll take a few questions. Yeah, please.
Yes, please, ma'am.
Hi. So, Abraham, I think you know I listened to Covenant. I didn't read it, so I had your voice in my ear for about 30 hours. And Kerala transcended place to become a character in the novel. I said Kerala transcended place to become a character in the novel Covenant of Water, similar to how in that movie All We Imagine Is Light, Bombay in the monsoon became a character on its own. So can you talk about when geography transcends place to actually become a character?
Geography.
Yeah, I think in, Kerala is really quite unique. If you think about it, it's a narrow strip of coastal territory, only 75 miles wide at its widest, and bordered on one side by the Western Ghats and on the other side by the ocean. And you have 44 rivers coming down from the mountains to the coast and breaking into hundreds of little tributaries and estuaries and ponds and streams. So it really does change the character of the people. I mean, water was the means of transportation, and you know, I took some liberties in saying this, but I think that there's a sort of a character trait of Malayalis that, to me, reminds me of water. There's a sort of a fluidity, not necessarily good or bad, but there it is. And so I felt that the geography was critical to the story because it's critical to people's lives. You know, I think it's a state that's been insulated to some degree from northern invasion by the mountains, and yet it's had tremendous Western or outside influence because of the traders coming for spices. It's been a coast where spices were traded from the time of the Greeks. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it would seem to me inevitable that people who grew up in that strip of territory should have certain unique characteristics. And my task as a novelist was to try and make sure that my characters were authentic to the geography, to the kind of ways they earned their income, to the houses they built, to the rituals that made sense to them, including how, you know, their houses responded to the monsoons and the rains and so on. So, you know, I did my best. It was kind of easy with Kerala because it's such a distinct geography. I think it would be more challenging to write about a land that perhaps didn't have quite that distinctiveness.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, I'm here. Just, yeah, the topic today, the geography and destiny and all that you spoke about, it was fascinating how you tied it together. And I loved how you brought in the political and also, you know, the local. I was wondering, in fact, you went as close as Ukraine, Russia, and how Musk interferes in it, but was there a conscious sidestepping of the Palestinian issue? It seems to be a big lack in the whole thing because it ties up to almost everything that you've spoken about till now.
No, but I mean, we covered several thousand years, so no, I think that you know, what's happened in the Middle East since 7th of October has been a total catastrophe, but the stories of how the insistence of Israeli national policies and histories and the ideas around what even the land should be called, whether it should be called Palestine rather than Canaan or so-called, or, you know, rabbinical names, is another example of the privileging of history to protect one people's version of the past, present and future at the expense of many, many others. So, you know, what's happened in Gaza has been a total catastrophe. I'm not sure how that connects to the question of geography and destiny, apart from it being a human rights disgrace and the fact that the international community hasn't managed to engage with it properly.
No, because the contention there seems to be about geography and about who owns the geography. And it isn't something that started on October 7th, clearly, and it started even pre-World War II. And I think the oil richness and the access to the sea, all of this matters in why that land has been contested and why the people, there's a race, you talked about race as well, and there's definitely a racial impact on how whoever's opinion on it is centered. So I feel that I was just wondering why it seemed to be like a whole, because you touched upon India and about Ukraine and Russia and the US, and you went to South America, but sort of left a gap in the middle there, and I was just
sure. Well, there are 2 million people in prison camps in Xinjiang. I didn't mention. We didn't talk about Rohingya. We didn't talk about what happens also here with Muslims in northern India. So I think there are lots of parts of the world, or looking at what's happening in Myanmar at the moment. I think there are lots of terrible parts of the world where we see horrific oppression. Of course, what's happening in Gaza is at the top end. In fact, the most deadly zone in the world at the moment is in South Sudan, in the strip between DRC and Ethiopia. 600,000 people killed there last year. So in a gore fest where we name check places that we want to feel better that aren't being talked about, and to have a sense that somehow by mentioning them in a throwaway sentence we're doing them justice, I'm not sure it solves any of the problems. So yeah, there's terrible oppression in the world. Geography is part of that story. But if you want a session on the Middle East, then I'm very happy to take part in it. But this is about geography, history writing, and trying to join up ways in which we think about the world. But yes, there are lots of parts that people who are not paid dignity, but I'm not sure a sentence or two fixes that.
Thank you, Peter. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Peter. My question's to you. So, from the advent of our species, we have always been traveled from places to places, been an immigrant. But over the past 300, 400 years, as there is a lot of fight over land and acquiring land and ownership of land. Can you please talk on this? As advent of species, we've always been immigrants. We've been moving places. But why all of a sudden, just over the period of 300, 400 years, there is a need to acquire and a possession of land?
Is that for me?
What's
Yes,
the
that's
need
for
to acquire land? Is that what you're asking, sir? Yes.
No, the feeling of possession. Okay.
The feeling of possession in the last 300 to 400 years,
yes.
why has that happened, though it has
That
not happened to you?
Which was, as in, before that, as in, we're talking about...
Yeah, okay, I understand. I don't think it's the last 300 or 400 years. I mean, technologies allow us to colonize at faster scale and bigger speed. So it might feel that it's a European project of global colonization. The Europeans did globally colonize. But I can promise you the Chola colonized, I can promise you the Pallava colonized, the Mughals colonized, the Qing dynasty. So I think that the pressure to be able to do it, the magnification is the scale and speed over recent centuries. But there are lots of reasons why people expand the control under their, the land under their control. The Mongols were the greatest empire builders in history. They were the largest single joined up territorial space built between about 1180s and the 1260s that reached from the Pacific coast, including almost up to Japan, attempt on Japan, right the way up to the Mediterranean. And some of that is about sheer ability to command control over taxation and money. Some of it's about resource. Some is about evangelism, spreading a set of ideas. There are lots of complicated motivations, but empires are part of the ways in which military bravery, particularly male bravery, have been over-prioritized at the expense of the mundane. And of course, you know, it's a good way to answer the question is that that's because history has served those empire builders well by recording their deeds, sometimes negatively. Mongols have about the worst PR reputation in history. But a lot of it is because we don't spend time writing about periods of peace and stability. So I was talking last night, one of my favorite German writers who says that the pages of peace are the ones that historians pass over in silence. You know, we don't think about stability. We don't think about what works. We don't think about equality. We don't write about bits that are where there doesn't seem to be much happening. We look for revolutions. We look for warfare. We look for empires. But there are lots of parts of the world that are pacific, reasonably equitable. But empire building is something that's not of the modern era. That goes back to the beginning of time.
I'm afraid we have time for only one question now. Yeah. One last question, please. I'm sorry, the gentleman here. Okay.
Yeah. So my question is to Abraham over here. And it was a really good conversation that you guys had. It was enlightening for me. The question is that there are usually two truths to whenever you see something. It's the truth of someone living in a particular geography. And then if you are an outsider, you have the perspective of that particular people from that geography, right? How do you strike balance between those two truths while writing a novel? And how do you not, let stereotypes affect in your writing?
Can we please take both the questions together? Maybe that will be better. Sir, your question is the last one, please.
Okay. Yeah, my question, actually, Peter touched on not wanting to get into ethnicities, but on the other hand, I think the Covenant of Water...
Can you please hold the mic closer to you?
The Covenant of Water has been reviewed in PLOS as well. You know, in the sense that, the question is, India, because of its practices of endogamy and consanguinity...
Sir, can you please hold the mic closer to you?
Yeah, the practices of endogamy and consanguinity, of marriage, intermarriage within communities and families, has created a certain genetic pool. And that is creating a certain destiny, which I think is possibly, part of the theme of the Covenant of Water, but is there more writing to be done about this?
This is about the genetic pool that is created through intermarriage.
Yeah, I think I'll try to answer both questions quickly. First, your question about the two kinds of truths. I mean, that's a profound statement. Honestly, when I'm writing, I'm not thinking in those kind of abstract terms. My only goal when I'm writing a novel is a good story well told. And if the story is good, it's because there's a truth that resonates with everyone when they read it. It may not necessarily be the truth that holds on the ground at that moment, but it's sort of a stunt that a writer is pulling off if they get you into a story. And like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you read his story and you go along with the fact that there's a very old man with enormous wings. And that doesn't hold with any truth that exists, but it's the truth of the novel. That's the best I can do. I'm not very good at answering sort of theoretical questions about a novel. But Chandru, your question is an interesting one, because in looking at a closed community like Kerala and a closed geography, and with marriages happening, even though they're not necessarily encouraged, between people who are related, by virtue of the fact that that small sect doesn't marry outside of the community, it would be no surprise that genetic diseases would be more common. I chose to give the family in my novel a genetic condition where one member of the family, going back many, many generations, drowns in the most inauspicious bodies of water, shallow ponds, bathtubs. And I based it on something of a disease that I was very well aware of in America, a very rare disease, only one kindred described, with no thought that it would ever actually be in existence in India or in Kerala. But I like the idea of the irony of a community that depends on water having a genetic condition where someone cannot swim, when most people swim before they walk. Literally, children swim before they walk. And to my great surprise, as you know, after the novel, I began to discover that not only was this particular condition common enough, or not rare in Kerala, but there were even relatives of mine who clearly, in retrospect, certain members of their family had the condition. So I think it's an interesting sort of way that the truth, as the previous gentleman said, works its way inadvertently into my story. But thank you also for your help with that particular question of genetics, which I learned a lot from talking to you.
And I'll just do 2 sentences on the genetic stuff. This stuff is toxic if you're a politician, right? So the northern part of India, 20% of the population have the same haplogroup as people in Scandinavia, right? Doesn't take much to realize that what starts to happen with the new materials and new abilities we have to be able to look at people's genetic composition, that you could be more or less pure. You could be more or less beneficial to your government because of your ethnic background. And in Turkey, for the last 20 years, you need to show on your government forms the genetic ancestry of your 4 grandparents at the moment, basically to find out if there are any Armenians in your family or Christians. That's at the moment done by checking your census. If your job involves a pinprick, where your blood group is tested, your genetic composition tested to see how Indian you are, what kind of Indian you are, what kind of ancestry you have, are there purities or impurities in your bloodline, it's hugely difficult. And here I follow very closely and carefully the discussions around what Aryanism means, what the Yamnaya civilization means, what a migration into the Indus Valley, who did that, where are the Brahmins from, where do the Sanskrit and Vedic texts come from, are they imports, are these ideas that are coming from the steppes of Central Asia? Those kinds of things spill over into very, very unpleasant discussions where we as scientists and historians have to be extremely careful to deal with data and to deal with material in ways that are very, very helpful to academic purity without fueling the kinds of things that are obvious because we've seen that before about who gets to control the means of production. And it's an answer that ties up lots of the things we talked about around empires, around travel, about stories of the past. But the same way that we think social media has not prepared us for the world of today and tomorrow, the new scientific tools we have for politics and history provide explosive toxicity that will be exploited by ruthless politicians, not just in India, but all over the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this lovely session. If I may announce, dear audience, all the three authors will be available for book signing sessions. Thank you so much, Nirmala ma'am. Thank you so much, Dr. Varghese. Thank you so much, Peter Frankopan, for this lovely session.